everybody. Good morning. All right, here we go. All right, hello. Hi, my name is Russ, and I am so excited that I'm here with you guys today. Thank you for having me. So I am the director of Sanctuary at Black Rock Church. If you've never seen me before, I'm not usually around, that's why. So Sanctuary is our young adults ministry. We have services on Sunday night, shameless plug, right? 5 p.m. So I'm used to ministering and talking to people between the ages of 18 and 35. But if you guys want to come through and check us out any Sunday evening, we don't check IDs at the door, so you're welcome to come through. My friend Bill, also known as the Waterman, you got to come through sometime. All right, so my family just moved from Vermont almost a year ago now, last September, to come to Fairfield, take this position at Sanctuary. So we're happy to be back in Connecticut. I grew up in Trumbull. Some of you guys know my dad or my parents. And so it's cool to be back around family in Vermont. We were all alone. So it's nice to be, I think that's my favorite part about Connecticut is the people. We just have family close by. You take family for granted when you don't until you don't have any. So thanks for having me. We're really happy to be here. And so I want to tell you guys a story first before we get going, based around this principle. You guys know this, even if you've never heard it before. When you go through something dangerous or life-threatening or painful with other people, it gives you the opportunity to grow closer together with them. You guys know that? Yeah, so I went through something just like this with my wife, but we were just dating at this point. This is back in the day, 2010. Travel back in time with me. Okay? For you note takers, put your pens down. I'm going to throw out a bunch of names. It's not important to write down the specific names. I'll just explain the relations as we go. But my wife and I, while we were just dating, girlfriend Bree and Russ, we were going to go on a date. And I was visiting Bree's family in upstate New York. Has anybody heard of Auburn, New York before? Oh, wow, we got it. That's actually really surprising. There was like 3 of you. Very impressive. So Auburn is known for the state prison. And so there's not a lot going on at Auburn. It's just kind of an empty town. They call it Prison City. And so we decided we were going to go bowling with Bree's younger sister, Mindy, and her boyfriend, Maddie. They got married much later, but right now it's just a double date. And Maddie was going to drive, which is great because I didn't have to drive. I drove all the way up to New York to see them, and so it was nice to just be a passenger. But I found out that Maddie is not the most responsible driver. Okay, he has a plethora of speeding tickets. Of course, with a bunch of other traffic violations. And he loved to drive fast, which wasn't normally an issue unless there's police around, I guess. And so we get in his car, and at this point, in 2010, the coolest thing you could possibly do with your car, I'm still convinced right now that it's still the coolest thing you could possibly do with your car, is you fill the trunk up with subwoofers. Okay, so Maddie's trunk was completely useless. It was just subwoofers. You could open the trunk. You couldn't even fit a backpack in there. So I felt like we were pretty awesome. We're driving down these roads. Bree's sitting next to me in the back seat, and we can't hear each other. And I'm cupping my hands around my mouth so that I could yell to her in hopes that she could hear me. I'm like, "You look great." She looks at me and says, "What?" We were getting heart palpitations from the bass coming through the back seat. If you've never been in this situation before, you need better friends. And then get in your friend's car and let them give you heart palpitations as well with the subwoofers. It doesn't matter what the music is, it's just, you can't hear it anyway, it's just the bass. So we're flying around Auburn, probably the coolest people in Auburn, and we come across an intersection that I've never come across in my life. It was a 4-way intersection, green lights all around, but everybody was stopped dead still. And, in Connecticut, we have, the world record for reaction times to green lights. We're as soon as it turns green, everybody's going, right? So, what are we doing? But Maddie's flying, like this. And so we're coming up on this intersection. The left lane is open. So Maddie, as we fly up, pulls into the left lane, and we're all like, "Ha-ha, suckers, with your slow reaction time," right? We're from Connecticut, we're going fast. So we fly up to this intersection, and right as we get to the intersection, all of a sudden, Maddie slams on the brakes. And I imagine we screeched to a halt. I couldn't hear anything, but this is what it probably looked like from the outside. Like that, all right? I couldn't hear anything. And then all of a sudden, right across the front of our hood, flies a huge fire truck with the sirens and lights going, and they're looking at us, and we're looking at them, and this is my reaction, guttural reaction. Ah! Right? Oh, but soon, I was immediately overcome by another emotion. Woo! Right? That feels good. This is what I wanted energy drinks to do, right? I could smell the rotation of the earth. I could taste gravity. I was alive. Do you know what feels good? Living, right? I was the boy who lived, and it was incredible, and I felt so alive. And then everybody else were like, yes, let's do that again. Let's back up and run it back. It feels so good to live, right? Who knew? And we're doing it together. And so I said it was an opportunity to get to know each other better. I didn't say it was a guarantee because my sister-in-law, my future sister-in-law, was so traumatized she forgot that I was even there. So looking back on it, we love to go and reflect on this memory of the time that we lived together. And we talk about it in all different situations and just like the emotion about it. And it's just fun. It's a memory that drew us all closer together, except for my sister-in-law and me because I wasn't there supposedly. But you know, you can't go on a double date with 3 people. So I was there, Mindy. When we go through something painful or difficult or life-threatening together, it gives us the opportunity to get to know one another better. And this principle isn't just true for each other, but it's also true with Jesus. When we go through something painful or difficult or life-threatening with Jesus, it gives us the opportunity to know Jesus better. So this morning I want to take a look at a Bible passage where we have 2 different parties. I have the world's longest sermon title, Biblical Relationships, Trust in the Face of Danger. You know, it's like you got to put the semicolon in there or whatever for those English people. So we're going to look at these relational and spiritual principles from the passage. We're going to pull these relational and spiritual principles out about these 2 different parties. And the 2 different parties we're going to look at today is Jesus and his disciples, his closest friends. And where we're going to find that is from Luke 8, 22 through 25. Luke 8, 22 through 25. If you don't have your Bibles with you today, we have it up on the screen so you can read it along with me, and it will help you remember it if you listen to it and you read it with your own eyes. Here we go. This is what it says. Luke 8, 22. One day, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's cross to the other side of the lake." So they got into a boat and started out. As they sailed across, Jesus settled down for a nap. But soon a fierce storm came down on the lake, and the boat was filling with water, and they were in real danger. The disciples went and woke him up, shouting, "Master, Master, we're going to drown!" When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and the raging waves. Suddenly the storm stopped, and all was calm. Then he asked them, "Where's your faith?" The disciples were terrified and amazed. "Who is this man?" they asked each other. When he gives a command, even the wind and the waves obey him. And this is a text that is so well known, it's easy just to read it and just think the same old about it. I grew up in the church from a very, very young age. I've heard this passage read. I've read it myself. I've listened to the audio Bible. I've heard message after message about this passage. And it's a passage that I stopped asking questions about. If you're around in the church for a long time, it's easy to stop asking questions about certain texts. Even the people outside the church know this story. This is like a David and Goliath type of story. It's well known even outside the church. So it's easy to stop asking questions. So I have a challenge for you as you go home. Write this down, you note takers, this time. When you go home, when you read this passage this week, read it and ask questions, even the silly questions. Line by line, just write down a question. Have a question about every single line. It's crazy what the Holy Spirit will reveal to you when you give him the opportunity. So for example, I got a whole bunch of random questions I went through questioning and answering that I hope help set the scene a little bit and make this passage come to life a little bit. And what's cool about this is it should come to life because this really happened. This isn't a fictional story that took place in Narnia, right? This happened in the Sea of Galilee. This is a real place. You go visit today. So a couple facts that I want to bring to light about the Sea of Galilee. I thought this was really interesting, and I hope it's interesting to you as well. If you've never looked up anything about the Sea of Galilee, get prepared for a little lesson, all right? This was enjoyable for me. I hope you learned something. So the Sea of Galilee is also known as Lake Tiberias. It's also known by a whole bunch of different names depending on who the conquering kingdom was controlling the area around the sea. So it's had a whole bunch of different names. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of the sea? Anybody? This is a real question. All right, someone's got to be real loud because you guys are all murmuring at the same volume level. Ooh, we have a hand. Yes, you. Waves, good. Anybody else? When you think of the sea, first thing that comes to your mind? Drowning? Someone's been scarred. Okay. But you know what? Someone over here, you gave the answer I was looking for. You know, you dig a little bit and you get gold. Whoever that was gold. Someone said salt. Right? Who was that? Yes! Let's go. Good job. All right. When I think of the sea, I think of salt. No one asked for lake salt, right? Everyone's like, hey, do you have any sea salt? The Sea of Galilee is fresh water. Who knew, right? Not me. Did you know it was fresh water? That's mind-blowing. It's also a lake. Couldn't believe it. So when Jesus asked the disciples to go across the Sea of Galilee, the point from where they were leaving to where they were going was 5 miles across. And this was really surprising to me as well, because I assumed that they couldn't see where they were going, that Jesus asked them to do this impossible task where they're seeing the curvature of the earth around the water because they have so far to go. They're trying to cross this. It's an impossible task that Jesus asked them to do, but no. And I don't really know what 5 miles across water looks like, but I do have the experience of standing on the beach in Fairfield looking across the Long Island Sound. Have you guys ever stood on the beach around here and looked across and you can see Long Island across the water? That is between 15 and 18 miles away. All right? So that gave me a really interesting picture because Jesus asked them to cross a third of the way across the Long Island Sound. I'm like, oh, that's a smart goal. It's totally achievable, right? The disciples have probably done this a million times. And the Sea of Galilee was also known for these really violent and sudden storms. And you could tell that by the reaction of the disciples. They're like, oh no. And it's not just that this happened then, it also still happens today. One of my coworkers, I was talking to him about his recent trip to Israel. And he said that he was on a boat crossing the Sea of Galilee, just like Jesus and his disciples. And he said it was crystal clear like glass, not a single wave to be seen, clear skies. They get off the boat. 15 minutes after they get off the boat, this huge storm comes in, these giant waves. And he was saying how thankful he was he got off the boat when he did. So it went from crystal clear glass to huge waves in 15 minutes. This still happens today because this is a real place. And I don't know why exactly the weather behaves like that there, but I have a hypothesis. And I don't know very much about science or geography or topography, but this is the second lowest lake in the world. It's 600 to 700 feet below sea level. So I imagine all the land surrounding the lake is probably coming down, kind of like a funnel, unprotected from the weather. The weather's all sweeping in, getting swirled around, pretty turbulent. It makes sense to me, but someone who's smart, you come correct me after, all right? So 4 of the disciples were fishermen. Fishermen that they grew up in a coastal town. And I was trying to look up what the life was of someone who would grow up in a coastal town, what that would be like on the Sea of Galilee, and I couldn't find anything until 1,000 years after this. So based on multiple cultures, 1,000 years after this fact, I discovered that the people who live around lakes like this, they go to the water for work, they go to the water for food, and they go to the water for fun. So their whole life revolves around the water. They're on the water all the time. And so when you grow up around the water, especially at this point in history, there's a lot of oral tradition around this, where you hear stories. And you grow up hearing stories because they're going to teach you as a kid about how to behave on the water when you grow up, how to behave near water. Because people remember stories better than they remember words, right? Just random like, hey, don't go in the water by yourself at night. But if you tell a story about someone drowning at night, and it's like a scary story, you're going to remember that principle a lot better. So they grow up hearing these stories, and then they hear stories about people getting lost at sea. Maybe they have somebody in their little town that they know or their family that's been lost at sea because of these turbulent storms that come through. These guys thought they were about to die in this storm, and I'm sure they know many people who have died from these same exact storms, from falling overboard. All right, one last thing. I want to talk about the boat really quick because, don't show it yet. Don't do the reveal. Okay, yeah, you forget that, all right? You guys didn't see anything. All right, I did a deep dive into boats because I was convinced. I was like, the boat that they must have been sailing in had to have been a colonial pirate ship that had a huge mast and a whole bunch of cannons sticking out the side, right? Because that's what I think of when I think of boats. Peter Pan, Captain Hook. So I did a deep dive into boats just to check what the boat would be like. How could they be scared? Of course, Jesus was sleeping in his captain's quarters, you know? But everything that I looked at until about 500 AD, everything we have evidence of is kind of like a glorified canoe. And then I found this one boat, which is really cool. You can toss it up now. Big reveal. Yeah. So this boat in 1989 was discovered because the Sea of Galilee went down quite a bit. And it's called the Jesus boat because it's a first century AD fishing boat. And this is what most boats look like until about 500 AD when we get a trade barge, which would be what I was hoping for a little bit more, something you could put cannons on and stuff. But imagine 12 people in this canoe. It's about 20 feet long. Of course it would get flooded with water in a crazy storm. And how did they get this boat? Whose boat was it? They never answer this. I have questions, I want answers, right? Whose boat was this? And maybe it's because the disciples that were fishermen grew up in the area, and maybe they have a boat, like a family boat they could just borrow. Maybe they work their connections, like, hey, remember me? I'm the fisherman disciple. And they're like, yeah, sure, you can borrow our boat. We trust you. We don't know. And then the last thing. Jesus was just laying there. There's no captain's quarters. Jesus was sleeping in the back of the boat. The boat's being overcome with water over and over again. There's intense rain. Jesus is getting soaked. And he's just sleeping, right? The danger didn't wake Jesus up. The disciples woke Jesus up. Jesus is an incredible sleeper. He's a deep sleeper. I'm like, Jesus, you would make a great parent. Sleep through anything. Okay, now that I set the scene, hopefully this comes to life a little bit more. Let's take a look at some spiritual principles from this passage. You ready? Difficult circumstances are not evidence of unbelief. Difficult circumstances are not evidence of unbelief. Unbelief is a rejection of a promise or a command of God for a particular situation. The storm wasn't what bothered Jesus. The difficult circumstance of the storm is not what bothered Jesus. The disciples' lack of faith and their lack of trust is what bothered Jesus. So question again, real question, answer yes or no. Do the disciples trust Jesus? There's a little bit of a mix, right? Yes. The correct answer is yes. The disciples did trust Jesus. But the thing is, trust isn't binary. It's not a yes or a no. It's not a trust or do not trust. Trust is on a scale. Let's say it's a 1 to 10. Because one quick example again. Do I trust my 4-year-old daughter? Yes, with her Hot Wheels, right? Do I trust her with control over my finances? No, right? I still trust her, it's just on a scale. I'm sure there's many people in this room you would trust. Let's say I give everybody a rubber band and they stretch it back and point it at you and they're like, I'm not going to shoot it, right? As soon as someone pulls back a rubber band, it doesn't matter how much you trust them, you're like, no, right? Trust is on a scale. Let's say it's from 1 to 10. 1 would be absolutely very minimal trust. You're barely trusting anybody. 10 would be you have absolute trust. You're like, sure, point that rubber band at me, right? That's 10. If the disciples' trust was a 10 out of 10 on this trust scale for this situation, what would the story have looked like? What if they followed Jesus' lead? The whole story would have been completely different because Jesus was the teacher after all, and they were supposed to follow his example. So what would the story have looked like if they fully trusted Jesus 10 out of 10? Maybe it would look like they took a nap, just like Jesus did. And maybe Luke 8:22 through 25 would be, Jesus and his disciples sailed across the Sea of Galilee through a storm by sleeping and trusting God to get them across safely. Right? It's laughable, it's silly, because that's not how anybody sails, but that's exactly how Jesus planned on sailing. We see that from his example. He just laid down and took a nap. That was his plan to cross the lake. We can trust in Jesus' example for us. It may be unorthodox, but he is faithful. We have example after example of people in the Bible bringing their storms to Jesus and seeing how he responds to them. And he will respond similarly to us in our storm. When the storm comes, we can rest in the trust that the Father will take us safely through. If your trust in Jesus was a 10 out of 10, you right now, if your trust in Jesus was a 10 out of 10, how would your response to the storm you were in look differently? How would the response to the storm you are in look differently right now? If you're in this service right now, you don't get to this point in life. It doesn't matter how old you are. If you've made it into this service, you don't get this far into life without having serious storms. Each and every one of us has storms. We have little storms, we have big storms, we have medium storms, we have life-altering, life-changing storms. So all of you have a storm. I'm sure you can think of one. What would the storm look like? I'll give you a real example of a storm that we're almost completely through at this point. So close. Real life example. 5 weeks ago tomorrow, so we're at 4 weeks and 6 days, my 4-year-old daughter told us that her tummy hurt. And then that quickly turned into such intense abdominal pain that she couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep. It was just pain 24 hours a day. She went from a girl who loved to sing and dance and twirl to just screaming in pain all day and all night. And there wasn't anything that we could do about it. It just felt helpless just standing around watching. Then a bunch of doctor's appointments and hospital overnights later, the doctors finally felt like they had a good idea of what this could possibly be. And then the head pediatrician comes in one day. We're at the hospital for a few days at this point. At Yale, go Yale, awesome hospital, pediatric hospital. And the head pediatrician comes in. I'm like, oh, this is cool. We've never met this person before. She comes in and she says, hey, I just want to let you know that the hematologists are going to come in. And they're going to tell you some serious news. I just want to prepare you for it. And what do you think my reaction is when she says that? I'm like, man, this news is so bad that we had to be prepared for the bad news. And the hematologists were these blood doctors, and we had gotten some really bad blood results at this point. So I was worried. There's a whole bunch of abnormalities in their blood, and the hematologists come in and they say, all right, this could be one of a few things. She may have something called HSP, which is this really long German name, which is something that's just inflammation of her blood, and it will go away on its own after about a month. Or this could be blood cancer. So this is a real storm. And maybe you don't have kids, so you haven't been in this exact situation before, but maybe you've gotten a bad diagnosis. Or maybe you've had a family member who's had a really bad diagnosis, and you know what storms like this are like. In that moment, 10 out of 10 trust was really hard. There was a lot of unknown. And I'd say my trust in this moment was maybe a 5 out of 10. And Bree and I, my wife, we knew what Jesus did when people brought their sick kids to Jesus in the Bible. We knew how Jesus responded. So we knew we had to lift Kiki up to Jesus, and we were going to say, Jesus, you have control of this. And so my wife was really good. She rallied like tons of people to pray for her. And we prayed for her. We said, Jesus, we trust you with Kiki. We trust you with whatever's going on in her body. But you know what? Even though I was saying I was trusting, and I was behaving and acting like I was believing I was trusting, I'd say my trust was like a 5 out of 10. And the reason why is because when I would go to sleep at night, I couldn't fall asleep. My mind was just spiraling with all these different ways that our life was going to change. If the worst result was true, and how like these hard conversations I was going to have with my boys about why their sister's going to have to stay at the hospital, and how our lives were going to change because of the bad things that could possibly happen, my worst fears coming true. When the storm comes, we can rest in the trust that the Father will take us safely through. He is faithful, and he proves it over and over again. Do you trust him? What would your storm that you've gone through or the storm that you're currently in look like if you trusted Jesus 10 out of 10? And this is something I thought about when I was staying there in the hospital, just wanting to go home. They kept saying just one more day, and they kept pushing it back and back and back. I'm like, man, what would this look like if I trusted Jesus on a 10 out of 10? I want to, but it's hard. And the good news is that trust is something you can grow in. The disciples, they didn't trust Jesus with their lives at this point. They trusted Jesus minimally, but they didn't trust him with their lives. But they grew to trust him with their lives, and many of them died violent deaths for Jesus and for Jesus' name. So your trust can grow. Just to complete that story really quick so I don't leave you all hanging. She did end up with HSP, which is great news. It is like the best situation out of anything that could have been. So yeah, praise God for real. All right, One of the main examples we have from the Bible about how to go through storms is to not go through them alone. Jesus and his disciples were in the boat together, but the disciples were going through the storm like Jesus wasn't with them. Like the disciples, we can go through storms like Jesus isn't with us. The spiritual principle we get from this is invite Jesus into your storms. Maybe they had the mindset of it would be weird to invite Jesus to help us because we're serving Jesus. If you've been in a serving role before, maybe you felt like that. Oh, it's hard to ask Jesus to come help when we're the ones who are supposed to be serving him. Or maybe they thought that Jesus didn't want to help or that he couldn't help. Have you ever had those thoughts? I have. Definitely have. So why didn't the disciples ask Jesus to help when the storm first came? The disciples were capable sailors. Like I said before, 4 of them grew up as fishermen. They were capable sailors. And they knew from experience being through storms, somewhat like this, that they could rely on their ability to survive, to make it through, to go through the storm. It worked in the past, so why wouldn't it work now? Jesus was really good at this church stuff. Jesus was really good in these services, but this was a real storm. The disciples had seen Jesus do miraculous things. They'd seen him heal people and cast out demons just by saying a word. But this wasn't one of Jesus' services. This was real life. My storm's different, Jesus. This didn't happen in the Torah. That's what they're saying. This didn't happen in the Holy Text. There was no saving people from a storm like this in the text. There's no story about someone saving a girl like this in the Bible. Jesus, my storm's different. This is the real world. We know people who have lost their lives from storms like this. The disciples have all these thoughts in their heads. And we see where the disciples placing their trust in their abilities gets them. They've maxed out their ability. They've done everything they can to weather the storm like they have in the past. They just think, if I keep trying a little harder, I'll be able to save us. We'll be able to save ourselves. We just keep trying a little harder. But we see what happens. The storm is too strong. It overcomes their ability. And it's at this point that they decide to invite Jesus into the storm. So they go over to Jesus who's sleeping, and I imagine they grab him, and they're like, Jesus, we're all dead. And then everything changed from that point. Also, side note, it's terrible of them to do that, right? Let Jesus die in peace. He would have died asleep. And they're like, Jesus, we just want to let you know that you're going to die a horrible death. We want you to be awake for it, right? Horrible. If we're ever in that situation, just let me go, right? Thank you. We don't need to wait until all hope is lost to invite Jesus into our storms. What would the storm have looked like if at the beginning of the storm, the disciples were like, hey, Jesus, I know you want to rest right now, but we're really in trouble. Would you mind giving us a hand? It's a small boat. I'm not really sure what he would do. Maybe they weren't really sure what he would do, but just asking for help. Why not ask when it first appears? Jesus wants us to trust him with our storms. He wants to be invited to be a part of it. He isn't bothered or disturbed by our storms. The reason why we know this is because Jesus, it was his idea to go across the lake on the boat. He knew the storm was coming. If he wanted to avoid the storm with the disciples, he would have walked. Walking was an option. It's a lake. It's not the Pacific Ocean. He could have just walked around and avoided the storm and been like, all right, I'll see you guys on the other side, right? He knew the storm was coming. He knew it was going to be super dangerous. He wants to be in the storm with us. He's right there. He just wants to be invited. Invite him into the storm. When it comes to the storms of life, don't take them on alone. Invite Jesus into your storms. I have this book that I've read to all my kids at this point. It's falling apart. There's tape all over. You got to hold the pages in it. It's like way too big. It's one of those, you know those books? It's called Quick as a Cricket. And it's this book about this kid who's comparing himself to all these different animals and how they share the same attributes. He's like, I'm as quick as a cricket. I'm as sly as a fox. I'm as cuddly as a bunny, right? And then there's this one that I felt like was really cool. I've always loved this picture, and I wanted to share it with you to help explain this spiritual principle. I'm going to show you the picture. Here it is. There it is. Look at that. Right there we have the boy. He's yoked up with a big ox, and he's pulling this really heavy wagon. This illustrates what it looks like to take on a storm. Imagine if the ox wasn't there, and he's trying to take on this burden all by himself. Even if the cart was completely empty, this kid would have a really hard time pulling the cart, right? He's barely holding up the yoke. It looks like he's being crushed by the yoke. The yoke's being held up mostly by the ox. He's being crushed by the yoke. He can barely move it, even if the wagon was completely empty. Inviting Jesus into your storm is like asking the ox to yoke up with you, to carry this big burden. The ox loves to work. The ox is strong. The ox is meant to pull the cart. That's the ox's whole existence, is pulling the cart. The ox loves to pull. I don't know if you've ever been to a pull before. You see these at fairs and stuff. People hooking big oxes up to these crazy huge sleds, and they love to pull. They just want to work. Jesus wants to be invited into your burden and help pull your burdens. He wants to be invited into your storms. You don't have to wait until all the boulders get in there. Even if the cart is empty, invite Jesus alongside you. So, if Jesus wants to come alongside you, how do you start actually trusting Jesus with your storm, with your burdens? So using this picture as an example, the kid has to decide at some point to stop putting in 100% effort, because it doesn't matter how much effort that kid puts forth, that cart's not moving. Having the ox come alongside, saying to the ox, all right, I'm going to let you pull this, and then trusting the ox to pull the majority of the weight, and you're going to follow the ox's lead, because the ox is the big weight puller. So for us, that looks like, all right, Jesus, this storm in my life, I'm going to give you ownership of it, and I'm going to start letting off the gas a little bit, and I'm trusting you to move this cart. Does that make sense? I don't know if I explained that in a confusing way. You guys got it? All right. This is an act of exerting trust that God will handle it. Jesus will handle it. And if he turns this way and that, you see how they're hooked up together? Follow his lead. Fighting against him, it's just taking the trust back away from him. Give him the trust. He's faithful. Last point before we're done. All right? The storm is raging all around. The disciples are seeing the boogeyman that they grew up with, right? Being washed overboard. They're seeing it come true. Their worst fear. Oh no, we're all going to be knocked overboard. We're going to drown at sea. Their worst fear is coming true. If their worst fear comes true and they're all washed overboard, guess who would be in the water with them? Jesus would be in the water with them. Jesus isn't magnetically connected to the boat. He's not going to stay with the boat while they all wash away. If their worst fear comes true, Jesus will be in the water with them. If your worst fear about your storm comes true, Jesus will be in the water with you. If my daughter ended up having blood cancer, Jesus would be in the water with me. Jesus would be in the storm with me. Even if your worst fear comes true, he is still with you. He's not staying behind in the boat. He is coming in the water right with you. Difficult circumstances are not evidence of unbelief. Jesus, he was the perfect God-man. He lived a difficult life. His own family rejected his message that he was the Messiah. And then the Pharisees, who were the religious leaders of the day, were supposed to be working with him. They were supposed to be paving the way, helping him in his mission. But instead, they fought him every step of the way of his ministry. Jesus lived a difficult life. It was not evidence of unbelief. So these difficult circumstances or these storms that you find yourselves in throughout your life, it's not because God's mad at you. God's not inflicting some sort of terrible situation on your life because God's mad at you. Difficult circumstances do not mean he's mad at you, and they're not evidence of unbelief. Invite Jesus to come alongside you today in whatever your situation is, whatever your storm is. Maybe your storm looks like the kids are home from school for the summer, or school's about to start, like tomorrow. Maybe that's what the storm looks like. Invite him in. Maybe you don't know how you're going to pay rent. Invite him in. Maybe there's a bad diagnosis in your family. Invite him in. Or maybe it's not something terrible, it's big, and all coming at once, but it's a slow trickle, like your job is sucking the life out of you. A little bit, day after day, week after week. Invite Jesus into your storm. Or maybe it's something good, you're excited for work. Invite Jesus in. Maybe you've never trusted in Jesus before. Maybe you've never invited Jesus into your life just to walk alongside you, like that kid with the wagon. Invite Jesus in. Even if you're an expert in the field and you're not sure how Jesus could possibly help, and you've known that storms like this have taken your friends, they've taken your family, and now the storm is here at your door. You know what the storm is capable of. Invite Jesus in. He is faithful. What circumstances are you struggling to trust Jesus with right now? What circumstances are you struggling with? Invite Jesus to come alongside you. If he didn't want to be a part of your storm with you, he would have walked. Leaving you was an option. But he wants to be a part of your storm. He wants to be with you. Don't go through your storm like he's not with you. Invite him in. Do you trust him enough to share it with him? Let me pray for us really quick. Jesus, thank you for just being so willing to be a part of our lives. You look at us as your children that you love so dearly, and you want to take care of us. We don't need to wait. We don't need to wait until things are out of our control and we're like, the only thing we do is have divine intervention. God, you want to divinely intervene even when stuff is going good. Because you love us. You want to care for us. Help us to trust you, God. Would you bring to mind those situations that we need to trust you in? And if we've never trusted you before, God, help us, show us, reveal to us how we can start today. We're so thankful for you. We bless you. Amen.